Welcome back to this quiet space where we deal only in truth. For a long time, you watched someone move through your life like they were untouchable, pulling the light out of you piece by piece and never seeming to run out of hunger. Today, we're going to look at what actually happens to that person when the performance ends. We're going to talk about the ending nobody warns you about, the one that catches up with them long after you've walked away. This is the part of the story they never wanted you to see. Picture something beautiful sitting untouched in a garage, a car that still looks powerful from the outside, chrome gleaming, engine silent. But underneath the hood, something has been corroding for years, slowly, quietly, until one day it simply won't start. That's what happens to a person built entirely around taking. They love the rush of pulling someone in, but they were never built to actually hold on to anything they took. For them, closeness was never real connection. It was always just a transaction, cold and calculated, dressed up to look like love. Think back to the strange restlessness you might have noticed in them as they got older. A kind of static energy just under the surface. You probably read it as confidence, as charm, as someone still winning at the game. But what you were actually watching was a system running too hot for too long, finally starting to break down. Someone who has spent a lifetime pulling pieces of other people into themselves eventually runs out of new places to pull from, and that shortage becomes its own kind of slow damage. So here's the real question we're answering today. What happens to a person like this once they've used up everyone around them? It's not something you'll find written up in a medical journal. It's something quieter and stranger than that, a kind of hollowing out that happens on the inside. While you're busy healing and rebuilding your life, they're facing something far bleaker, waking up every day inside a body that's aging and a self that was never really there to begin with. You probably spent years confused about how someone could turn into a completely different person seemingly overnight, sometimes before you'd even fully processed what happened. It was never only about control, though control was part of it. It was about offloading. Every ugly thing they couldn't sit with in themselves, they found a way to hand off to you instead. They walked away lighter. You were left carrying weight that was never yours to carry. Today we're talking about the debt that never gets paid back, the one that eventually comes due whether they're ready for it or not. This is the part of the story they'd rather you never learn. They want you to believe they're the ones holding all the cards, that they're untouchable, magnetic, always a step ahead. But the truth is the opposite. They need your response more than you ever needed their attention. Underneath all that bravado is someone far more dependent than they'd ever admit, and the wear and tear on the inside is simply the cost of building an entire existence around consuming other people rather than growing anything of their own. Eventually, the shell they built cracks from the inside. Try to imagine what it must feel like to only exist because someone else is paying attention to you, to have no sense of self that isn't borrowed from somebody else's reaction. When that attention dries up, when the room finally goes quiet, there's nothing left reflecting anything back to them. And in that silence, they're stuck alone with the one person they've spent their whole life running from, the frightened, wounded version of themselves hiding behind everything they built to seem impressive. Quiet has a way of telling the truth that noise never could, and eventually that truth catches up with them. They chase the thrill of pulling someone new into their orbit, but they were never able to actually use what they took. Every relationship was just a temporary patch over a wound that kept festering underneath, no matter how good things looked on the surface. And over the years, that internal damage doesn't just stay hidden, it starts to show. They end up carrying the residue of everyone they've ever used, wearing it whether they realize it or not. Stay with me because we're going deeper into the fears they'll never say out loud, the ones that turn getting older into something genuinely frightening for them. This isn't just a story to make you feel better. It's a real look at what happens when a person spends their whole life building an identity with nothing solid underneath it. Once you understand it, you'll never watch them perform the same way again, because the power you thought they had is shifting back into your hands. Let's start here, because this is where your clarity begins. You've probably spent time blaming yourself for the coldness that crept into that relationship, convinced there was something you weren't giving enough of. But that distance was never about you. It was them quietly falling apart on the inside, long before you noticed anything was wrong. They lost their grip on you the moment you decided your own peace mattered more than feeding whatever hunger they had. Keep that in mind as we go further. Their pain, however hidden, is the one honest thing they'll ever actually experience. To really understand what happens to someone like this over time, we need to talk about what's actually going on underneath. A person who was never given or never built a solid sense of who they are. Someone like this needs a constant stream of outside input just to feel like a real whole person. What looks like desire in the moment is really something closer to a transaction, an extraction dressed up as intimacy, performed by someone with no real home inside themselves. Think of it like a hologram that only exists because a projector is feeding it a constant stream of light. You were that light, and when that connection gets cut, through age, through loss, through people finally walking away, the image starts breaking apart. By the time that isolation really sets in, whatever illusion they'd built starts flickering and glitching, and underneath it you can finally see the frightened, small version of them that was always there. Being seen like that is devastating for someone who built their whole identity on not being seen. Their pursuit of new partners was never really about desire, it was about regulation. Someone like this doesn't have the internal tools to process their own emotions, so they need somewhere to put what they can't hold. You weren't a partner to them in the way you thought you were. You were more like a filter, quietly processing poison they couldn't handle on their own. But when there's no one left to filter it for them, that poison doesn't go anywhere. It stays right where it is and starts doing damage from the inside. It helps to think of this emptiness as a kind of hunger that consumes a person's character because there's no stable center holding them together. They're at the mercy of whatever outside validation happens to blow their way. When the supply is steady, they feel powerful, even invincible. But once that supply disappears, there's nothing left propping them up. And the crash that follows is its own kind of psychological death. Picture a star that's burned through all its fuel and starts collapsing in on itself. That's what happens to someone like this in the later years of their life. They've used up their sources, damaged their reputation, and now they're floating alone in a universe of their own making, still desperately searching for someone new to latch onto. Except by now, the damage is too heavy and they can't move the way they used to. What's left is a kind of chaotic internal noise, a storm they can't quiet. Part of that storm is convincing themselves you were the problem all along, because that story lets them avoid looking at themselves. But that story only holds up for so long. Eventually, the noise in their own head gets too loud to outrun. They start seeing you everywhere, not because they miss who you were to them, but because they miss what you gave them. Somebody like this wears out their own nervous system over the years, chasing the same high over and over with less and less to show for it. Each new pursuit takes more effort and delivers less payoff, until eventually even winning doesn't feel like anything anymore. They keep climbing towards something that no longer has any reward at the top. In the quiet hours, they start to lose touch with themselves almost physically, struggling to feel grounded in their own body. They need someone else's presence just to feel solid, and without it, they start to feel like they're dissolving into nothing. This is really the core of it, a person who has completely lost any sense of center. Somewhere underneath everything, real vulnerability disgusts them because it reminds them of a weakness they can't stand in themselves. They resent the people who love them for it. But eventually, once they're alone long enough, that same disgust turns inward. They start hating what they see in the mirror. They're drowning in self-loathing, and every hand that reaches for them gets bitten because trust was never something they knew how to accept. What we're really describing is someone running out of steam entirely, a system that's cooling down toward nothing. The damage they've done to themselves isn't dramatic. It's just the slow, quiet outcome of everything catching up at once. Now let's talk about what happens on your side of things, what it looks like when you finally stop giving your energy away. This is the turning point where the balance shifts from the person who's been taking to the person who's finally choosing herself. It usually happens in a moment of real stillness, late at night, alone, when they realize whatever used to work on you simply doesn't anymore. Their charm doesn't land, their image doesn't hold up the way it used to. This is the twist they never saw coming. The very thing that used to fuel them has gone stale in their hands. You'll watch them scramble when the mirror stops giving back what they need. It looks a lot like withdrawal, tears that come too easily, promises that sound too big, all in an attempt to see if the old patterns still work on you. But you don't move. And that stillness is more unsettling to them than anything else could be because it means they've become irrelevant to you. That's the real loss for them, not you specifically, but the realization that they no longer have power here. For you, this is where things start to click into place. You start to see the whole dynamic for what it actually was, a distortion you were living inside without realizing it. Once you take that distortion off, you see them clearly, someone small and frightened, dressed up as something powerful, still performing for an audience that stopped watching. You're not angry anymore. You're just observing, almost like a scientist studying a pattern from a safe distance. When the old tactics stop working, they usually try something new, playing the victim. Suddenly, there's a crisis, an illness, a financial emergency, anything designed to pull your sympathy back in. It's a last attempt to hand you their pain and get you to carry it again. But you can see the strategy now. You recognize the performance for what it is. And once you can name what's happening, it stops having power over you. You can walk right past it without getting pulled back in. Your absence becomes its own kind of consequence. Without you there to absorb what they can't handle, everything they've been avoiding starts catching up with them. They begin lashing out at everyone around them, creating chaos just to feel something because they've lost the calm center that used to balance them out, and that center was you. Eventually, in a last effort to protect their own image, they'll try to rewrite the story completely, telling anyone who'll listen that you were actually the problem all along. That accusation says more about their own collapse than it ever could about you. And strangely, hearing it doesn't hurt the way it might have before. Watching them walk away this time feels less like loss and more like relief, like something heavy has finally been lifted. You start to notice the shift almost immediately. The moment they're gone, your space feels different, lighter, clearer. Maybe you clean the house, open the windows, let some air back into rooms that had felt closed off for a long time. You start to understand that whatever toxicity had settled into your life wasn't something that belonged to you. It was something they carried in, and now that it's gone, your energy starts coming back on its own. There's a kind of forgiveness that comes with this too. Not for them, but for yourself, for whatever ways you adapted just to survive something that was never sustainable. You start treating yourself with more care, because you understand now that what you went through forced you to find strength you didn't know you had. In a strange way, you can even be grateful for it, because it broke something in you that needed breaking so something stronger could take its place. This is the point where you really let go. Looking back doesn't sting the way it used to. It starts to feel more like understanding, like you can finally see the whole shape of what happened without getting caught up in the emotion of it. The person who once felt so central to your life becomes almost a footnote, a rough patch you moved through on your way to somewhere better. And that shift is permanent. You start showing up in your own life with a kind of presence that feels unfamiliar to anyone who only knew the smaller version of you. Keep in mind, through all of this, that someone like this needs your reaction to feel real. Once you stop reacting, once your attention is no longer available to them, something in their sense of self starts to come apart. They might create chaos trying to get a rise out of you, but you're no longer pulled into it. You're watching from a distance now, safely outside the fire instead of trying to put it out. What follows for them is closer to a full collapse. The identity they built starts crumbling under its own weight once there's nothing external propping it up anymore. This is sometimes described as a kind of psychological unraveling, a confrontation with the emptiness they've spent their whole life avoiding. You might see reckless behavior, desperate attempts to hold on to relevance, and consequences finally catching up in ways that are hard to hide from other people. Meanwhile, you're moving through the world differently, calmer, steadier, less reactive to whatever noise they try to make. Whatever narrative they tried to spin about you starts falling apart on its own, because people eventually notice patterns, especially when there's more than one person left in their wake. You become proof that the story wasn't what they said it was. And in the middle of their unraveling, you can watch without needing to say anything. You already know the truth, and that's enough. They'll likely keep looking for someone to fill the space you used to occupy, but nothing quite works the same way. No one gives back what you gave, because what you gave wasn't ordinary. It was real empathy, and that kind of thing isn't easy to replace. What follows for them is often a harder, lonelier version of the same pattern, repeating with less and less around them to draw from. Meanwhile, you keep moving forward, unaffected by whatever's happening on their end. Everything about this story, told plainly, comes down to someone who underestimated how strong you actually were. By choosing to grow instead of staying stuck, you effectively ended their hold over you, whether they see it that way or not. What's left of them is someone carrying around the weight of a life they never really lived authentically. They resent you simply for surviving something they assumed would break you permanently. Every bit of peace you find afterward is, in its own way, a quiet contradiction to everything they believed about themselves. Sometimes that resentment shows up as fixation, watching your life from a distance, looking for any sign that you're struggling, any hint that you might come back. But there's nothing there for them to find. What they see instead is someone who's stronger than they expected, and that's uncomfortable for them in a way they can't fully explain, because it undermines everything they told themselves about their own power. Eventually, even the people around them start pulling away. Family members, mutual friends, anyone who finally sees the pattern clearly. What's left is isolation, the very thing they spent their whole life trying to avoid by keeping people close only to use them. In that isolation, there's nowhere left to hide from themselves. Whatever lies they've been telling, to you, to others, to themselves, start echoing back at them with nothing left to distract from it. Meanwhile, you're somewhere else entirely, having taken the space you needed to heal and grow instead of shrinking under the weight of what happened. Once you've done that work, their old tactics simply don't reach you anymore. Whatever charm or manipulation used to work has nothing left to grab onto because you're simply not available in the way you once were. As things settle further, you get to watch all of this from a place of real peace rather than anger. You're not looking for revenge. You're just noticing that the world feels more orderly now, more within your control. Their frustration becomes background noise, something you barely register anymore because you're healing at your own pace, on your own terms, faster than anything they're doing could ever slow you down. Looking back at everything that happened, you start to realize you actually came out ahead. What felt like an ending was really the beginning of something better. You found things about yourself you might never have discovered otherwise: resilience, clarity, a stronger sense of who you actually are. This final part of the story is the good part, the part where everything starts to feel hopeful again, where the heaviness lifts and something brighter takes its place. Everything difficult you witnessed in them was never something you caused. It was simply the outcome of a life built without any real foundation underneath it. For a long time, you were the thing keeping them steady, the resource they leaned on without ever giving anything real back. But you've stepped away from that role now. They're left facing a version of life they helped create, and it's heavier than they expected. Real closure comes from understanding that the person you loved wasn't quite real. You were, in many ways, in love with your own capacity for empathy, reflected back at you, and now you've reclaimed that capacity for yourself. You're closing this chapter for good, and you're doing it with a clear head. Any hostility that comes your way afterwards says more about them than it ever could about you. People who are unhappy inside often resent anyone who seems to be doing better because it highlights the gap between where they are and where they wanted to be. That doesn't have to be your burden anymore. Real healing isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's steady. It's the feeling of standing firmly in your own life, speaking honestly, and looking toward a future that finally feels open instead of closed off. You're teaching your own mind and body to expect kindness again, to expect safety, to trust that not every relationship has to cost you this much. You're learning that your empathy was never the problem. It's actually one of your greatest strengths, as long as it's directed somewhere that can actually meet it halfway. You found something solid inside yourself, something that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval to stay standing. You've been through something difficult and come out the other side more grounded than before. Whatever noise comes from their direction now barely registers. It's simply not loud enough to reach the life you're building. You've shifted your focus entirely, and in doing so, you've joined countless other people who've walked a similar path and come out stronger for it. There's real strength in that shared experience, in knowing you're not alone in having lived through something like this and come out okay. Whatever fixation they still have on you is really the last gasp of something that's already ending. The kind of dynamic they thrived on is becoming harder and harder to maintain, and more people are learning to recognize it for what it is. Your story, and stories like it, are part of what helps other people recognize the same patterns sooner and protect themselves earlier. Picture yourself somewhere high up, a mountaintop at sunrise, wind moving through the air around you, carrying off whatever heaviness is left over from everything you've been through. Below you, all of that difficulty is fading into the distance, dissolving in the early light. Above you, the sky is full of color again, color you can actually notice and appreciate now that you're not carrying so much weight. You feel whole. You feel complete. You feel, finally, like you're home in your own life. Meanwhile, whatever's happening on their end continues without you. A person circling the wreckage of choices they made, wishing for something that isn't coming back. But you're not looking backward anymore. You're moving forward, lighter than you've felt in a long time, toward people and places that actually deserve your energy. You found people who see you clearly. You've found a version of peace that isn't conditional on anyone else's behavior. Whatever difficulty came before was hard, but it wasn't wasted. It was simply the process that got you here. The truth is, they never really understood what they were dealing with. They wanted to keep you small, keep you dependent because they were afraid of what would happen if you ever realized your own strength. But that fear came true anyway. You grew beyond anything they expected, and there's nothing they can do about it now. You get to feel proud of that. You get to feel unstoppable because you built this new chapter yourself without needing anyone's permission. You get to take back the space you lost, the voice you quieted, the sense of confidence that got chipped away over time. None of the difficulty you went through has any power over you anymore. What you have instead is the ability to create something good with your life, to be a source of warmth for yourself and the people who actually deserve it. You're not defined by what happened to you. You're defined by what you chose to do afterward. That difficult chapter is finally over. Whatever mask was there has fallen away completely, and what's left is simply you, steady, whole, and finally free to move forward on your own terms.